straight ahead.
Don't look at the
You're
camera.
on.
Yeah. That's nice. Someone Google me and you'll figure out why I don't like cameras. Okay. You can do that later. Okay. So, I'm Emily and I'm presenting Emily's thesis. I'm not talking about myself in the third person. Okay, so Emily's topic is the English infant welfare movement in the first decades of the 20th century, and it's titled so far, Perceptions of Women as Mothers and More in the Infant Welfare Movement. Her intended argument in brief is that through the foundations, actions, and legacy of the infant welfare movement, the public began to recognize the importance and influence of women in ensuring happy and healthy infants, which resulted in the empowerment of said women. She will further argue that the addition of modern medical advice to the movement allowed women to be recognized as effective medical caregivers and mothers, and her research will approach this recognition as one reached by the medical establishment, the government, and the public by engaging with three major secondary sources: War is Good for Babies and Other Young Children by Deborah Dwork, The Politics of Motherhood by Jane Lewis, and Metropolitan Maternity by Laura Marks. Overall, she'll argue that this empowerment was beneficial not only to the particular women involved, but to British families and society, by exploring how it shaped women's thinking and outcomes. That's what I wanted to add. Okay, so Emily situates the development of the infant welfare movement firmly in its late 19th century context. Based on her secondary sources, she's concluded that several factors influenced the growth of the movement. There was the birth of the eugenics movement and concern for the future of the British white race, the poor quality of the average British soldier in the late 1890s Boer War against African people, and the release of a book titled Infant Mortality, A Social Problem in 1906, which told Brits that infant health reflected a society's prosperity, so for their babies to be unhealthy or to die was to suggest that England was pretty lousy. She feels that the simultaneous emergence of other English welfare programs can provide insight into the growth of the infant health movement in particular. So realizing that the time and length of the thesis constrain her from examining it as a whole, she is elected to focus on certain institutions that developed within it, known as the Infant Consultation Centers and Schools for Mothers. They were multifaceted facilities. Mothers could bring infants to be weighed and examined by doctors or receive other health-related services. And in the schools in particular, they could seek education about best practices for health, hygiene, and child rearing, or occasionally get nutritious meals at a low cost. Her decision to focus on these institutions will allow her to focus specifically on the impact of the infant welfare movement on women, since they were the primary targets of these facilities. So, to my mind, when I looked at Emily's thesis, I saw it intersecting the historiography of three main thematic fields. There's the obvious, she's studying England, so her thesis will fit into the historical narrative of British history as well. But I saw her three main thematic fields as social history / women's history, political history, and medical history. So fundamentally, the story of welfare is a story of social movements, reflecting the mindset of the community from which it originates and to which it offers services, and the infant welfare movement is no different. Utilizing newspapers, periodicals, popular literature, and private manuscripts, she intends to argue that the British public, in her time period, increasingly came to understand women as the most important link in keeping babies healthy. Primarily, the women involved in teaching and in helping out were upper-class women helping lower-class women. So she suggests that the story of this welfare movement was a story deeply influenced by class and had very elitist beginnings, which maps onto broader histories of social welfare. She's presenting her thesis as intersecting the history of welfare movements that historians have frequently presented as merely munificent, and she argues something deeper. She also deepens the social history by exploring the welfare movements as a result of a mindset created by, as I said, eugenics and military situations, both of which may get some coverage in her thesis, but seems like she's just looking at that as the context. She's also challenging perspectives in the history of English women. Historians who have studied the involvement of women in British social movements surrounding welfare have largely examined only how their roles in the broader society changed, and that they have presented these women as highly focused on inclusivity and community benefits, and she argues that this isn't universally true, and that it's more important to examine a story of women and how they felt about what they were doing, how their opinions changed about themselves and their community. Political history in Emily's thesis may not seem obvious at first, But because the infant welfare movement began primarily as a charitable private organization, as a result, the services available varied significantly by community and organization. But over time, the consultation centers and schools for mothers became recognized as groups doing important and effective work. And the government began to insert itself in the infant welfare movement as a result, crafting legislation that involved the government in a baby's life from its entry into the world, appointing ministers of health as official monitors of the program, and overseeing activities through national leagues for education. Cities also began to work in tandem with the communities and centers, developing the health services that dominate Britain today. And the increasing involvement of government in what had previously been a private charitable field speaks to broader shifts about its place in the lives of citizens. Finally, and here's how we understand why she has meetings scheduled with professors in public health and the history of medicine. It's a story of medical history as well. As I mentioned before, the welfare movement became to rely ever more upon modern medical advice. Medicine seems to have begun to concern itself, as Emily presents it in her prospectus, not only with treating infants, but with applying its discoveries toward preserving well-being. The English medical community turned its attention toward evaluating the quality of the schools for mothers. Various medical journals looked at the efficacy, and the involvement of women in the centers seemed to be a very hot topic for discussion among the medical community. Medical officers of health played a role in their explored the role played by their female counterparts, which also fits in the medical history by showing how they influenced and changed the medical community. Okay, briefly I'll talk about how she's arguing with the secondary sources because I realize that I'm very short on time. She's going to look at Dwork's War is Good for Babies and Other Young Children because Dwork provides much of her context, but she mostly examines how the infant health movement gave rise to the programs today, which Emily feels does a disservice to the history by not truly analyzing the changes for women. Lewis's book on the politics of motherhood takes a very cynical approach, saying that the welfare movement was only to meet political purposes, which Emily objects to. Even though political purposes are relevant, the outcomes were much deeper than that. And finally, Marx's Metropolitan Maternity gives her an idea of what availability of infant services did for women, but it doesn't go deep enough. It shows how society changed, but not women. She thinks Marx has her guns pointed in the wrong direction. Hospitals, which she examines, don't appear to be the epicenter of the movement, but rather the consultation schools, centers and schools for mothers. And to do all this research and to look at her primary sources, she gets to travel to London. So, good for her.
Right. Thanks, Emily. Emily did a great job. I think that covered like a lot of everything I intended to talk about. And I think that one thing that became apparent to me was I read this source that was by a group of women who started one of the most well-known like schools for mothers I guess, that was in London. And in reading it, there was like a very, I guess you can kind of call it like paternalistic, like we need to take care of these people or these women because they're going to mess up the future generation. Kind of like Emily was saying, there was like the eugenics movement was very involved in it. But I think that in that, even though it started out as kind of elitist, the way that they talked about, like they had anecdotes in there of the people that they met, and so it started to take a more personal view. And I think that once they like met the people, then you could see, like once they started coming into contact with this other class, that the views could change because it wasn't this unknown group. It was like people that they worked with and people who they saw having an effect, and being able to like take this advice to heart and make a difference in that. So I think that that's something that I hope to get from the primary sources that I hope to be able to see. So there's that. And then one of the other things that Emily touched on, so these services were kind of grouped into the National Health Service when that came into being a couple decades after this. And so I think that that shows, so it's a symptom of like a greater movement where they're understanding the importance of caring for everyone. And so that's something that I hope to maybe explore as well. So just changing perceptions and maybe views of their own importance, if that makes sense. Okay. Who's got questions?
So this, if I'm not mistaken, this was all going on in the early 1900s, right? So that's kind of like during the progressive era, and
Yeah.
it sort of coincided with, in America, this idea of maternalism or maternalist politics of women sort of acting as mothers in the public sphere, and like that was the way that women could exit that sort of Victorian private sphere, only as mothers, sort of extensions of private life. Is that connected to your topic?
Yeah, and I think
Does that speak to empowerment, or do you know what I mean? Like,
and I think it definitely like starts as that, but then once there's a greater involvement of like women as professionals as the movement progressed. So like I'm thinking the beginning of the 20th century, like up until World War I, and so more and more they realized that if women were the ones providing this advice, like as doctors or nurses or however it was, that was more effective than like a man doing the same job, which I thought, so it's like still kind of in the role of motherhood, but still like,
but it's
sort of crossing over.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
it's like a tandem.
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah. So hopefully I'll be able to.
Thank you.
Okay, cool. Okay, so
Change hats.
Emily, presenting other Emily's thesis, not in the third person as well. Tentatively titled Land of Hope and Misery, The Lives of Women in Michigan's Copper Country from 1880 to 1930, and hope and misery both describing emotions that maybe the women there had felt, and names of two places in the region that Emily's studying. So I thought, super cool title. Okay. So, as you might remember, Emily has a particular interest in Copper Country because of her family's history, and this will play a role in how she explores the topic. And just to start, I guess we'll define a few terms for maybe the non-Michiganders in the room. So if this is the Upper Peninsula, this is the Keweenaw Peninsula, which is where Copper Country is, and it refers, so this was an area that came to be known for its vast copper deposits. And mining of these began in like the 1850s, 1860s in smaller companies, and then they grew to be big business by the 1890s, which is a little bit into the period that Emily intends to study. As will become important to the argument of Emily's thesis, the miners who came to Copper Country were of many ethnicities. The early employees looked like, a lot of the early immigrants to America